Now, generations later, I make another attempt. I conceived the idea of finishing the autobiography while reading the Papers of Benjamin Franklin, a joint project of the American Philosophical Society and Yale University and published by Yale University Press. While perusing his papers, I made a remarkable discovery. Franklin had virtually written, albeit in bits and pieces, the remainder of his illustrious life through his journals, essays, and letters to his relatives and friends about family life, politics, science, business, literature, and philosophy. As Carl Van Doren, Franklin's premier biographer, explains, for Franklin, the most widely read of autobiographers, was an autobiographer by instinct and habitual practice. There was much to work with. Franklin kept a series of diaries. In letters to his close friends and relatives, he gave charming details of his domestic existence and related many behind-the-scenes political maneuvers in London and Paris. In one instance, Franklin wrote a 3-page letter to Lord Kames summarizing his 2 years in America, 1762 to 1764. Not all his letters survive, but those that do paint a full picture of the man and his colorful career and character. In addition to these letters, Franklin composed 3 important chapters he intended to include, in whole or in part, in his autobiography. First, his tract relative to the affair of Hutchinson's letters. Second, an account of the negotiations in London for effecting a reconciliation between Great Britain and the American colonies. And third, Journal of the Negotiation for Peace with Great Britain from March 21st to July 1st, 1782. He showed the second of these papers to Thomas Jefferson in March 1790 as a sample of the history of his own life Franklin was preparing. All 3 were written after he wrote the first part of the autobiography in 1771, and he no doubt was planning to incorporate them when he reached the years in which these events took place. I have included all 3 monographs in condensed form in the Completed Autobiography. I do not think the spirit of Franklin's history was violated in condensing these 3 lengthy monographs. As Franklin wrote the Duc de la Rochefoucauld regarding the Memoirs, I am persuaded there are many things that would, in case of publication, be best omitted. It is important to note that these 3 essays were further fragments of a work which is itself a fragment. Van Doren makes this important point, one that should not be overlooked by those who think completing Franklin's autobiography is an impossible or inappropriate task. Franklin frequently revised the autobiography, and in some ways, the entire book should be considered an unfinished work, in need of further revisions. From the beginning of this project, my objective was to create a work entirely in the hand and voice of Franklin. After extensive research into his life and papers, I became more and more optimistic that my lofty goal could be achieved. Now, at the end of this journey, I have the happiness to conclude that Franklin's entire personal history can be told in his own words. Yet it was not an easy task. Given the complexity, disparity, and mammoth volume of Franklin's writings, the construction of the Completed Autobiography required considerable judgment as to what should be included and what should not. Finishing his memoirs entailed much more than simply gathering and reprinting his papers. He left behind hundreds of thousands of documents which, when finally gathered and published, will exceed 50 printed volumes. My edited compilation probably represents less than 2% of his writings, yet it is in large measure a complete story. All along I felt as though I was assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle, not knowing precisely what the final image would be. Now, after months of effort, I see the big picture, a smiling Franklin. After reading through his papers and major biographies, I tried to put myself into Franklin's way of thinking and sought to imitate his selection process as seen in his autobiographical writings. Like Franklin himself, I decided to omit facts and transactions that may not have a tendency to benefit the reader, hoping that the book will be found entertaining, interesting, and useful. I have relied on Franklin's detailed outline of his memoirs, which he referred to himself when writing the autobiography. Just as he injected historical events into his account to make a philosophical or moral point, so too have I inserted Franklin's stories into the completed autobiography. And like Franklin in his memoirs, I have omitted his published essays, such as The Way to Wealth, and focused on his personal commentaries on events, individuals, ideas, and pursuits. In a few cases, I have relied on letters from friends about Franklin rather than by him. For example, it is unfortunate that few, if any, documents survive about his involvement in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He apparently chose not to write about these singular events, privately or publicly, much to our loss. So I have had to rely mostly on several third-party sources for Franklin's perspective. Franklin's lengthy commentary on the American Revolution, for example, comes from the diary of Arthur Lee, one of the commissioners to France, who spent an evening reminiscing and discussing with Franklin the events of the year and a half following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and then recorded the conversation in his own diary. The editors of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin considered this source so Franklin-esque that they have included it in the papers. Sometimes I discovered a reference Franklin made of an important event, such as his wife's death, written years after the fact and buried in some obscure letter to a friend or relative. In these and other cases, a paragraph in the completed autobiography may draw from several sources in order to create a chronologically accurate and full record of Franklin's life. As the reader will note in the citations at the end of the book, I often drew upon a half-dozen references to tell the full story of an incident. In short, the completed autobiography is thoroughly Franklin. Some have wondered if it might be better simply to reprint Franklin's letters and essays rather than attempt to finish his autobiography in a single volume, which only he could do to his complete satisfaction. Indeed, many of his famous letters, journals, and essays have been reprinted as appendages to the autobiography in various editions or as Franklin anthologies. Yet most of these anthologies are out of print, while the autobiography continues to be reprinted and sold in bookstores. In my mind, it suggests a need for a newly fashioned memoir as a better way of recording the colorful and controversial later years of the charismatic, wise, and clever Dr. Franklin. I have corrected much of the spelling, grammar, and sentence structure to reflect modern English usage and have made structural changes in tense and person to create a seamless flow of writing. In no circumstances do these minor changes affect the meaning or style of Franklin's prose. At the same time, I have maintained some of the Old English spelling and abbreviations that Franklin used to give the work a sense of history. Franklin's autobiography could not have been completed without the excellent work of the editors in charge of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin, which now exceed 37 volumes. In addition to these published volumes, I relied heavily on copies of Franklin's unpublished letters and other documents in their possession, as well as extensive correspondence in French that the editors have had translated into English. I wish to thank in particular Ellen Cohn, the current editor of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin, for her assistance and guidance, although I alone take responsibility for compiling and editing the completed autobiography. What drove me to finish Ben Franklin's memoirs? I've had a lifelong interest in the grandfather of our nation. I find him the most creative, successful, entertaining, and approachable of the Founding Fathers. His multifaceted career and personal life are endlessly fascinating, and Franklin would be famous today even without the role he played in the American Revolution.